Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about springs and wells and artesian wells. So springs is water that's coming out of the ground, and wells is water that's coming out of the ground, and an artesian well is water coming out of the ground. They come in different ways and for different reasons. A lot of it has to do with the topography of the land, what kind of rocks are underneath the ground, how high the hills are around in that area. And we'll see that humans, of course, need that water. It's in the ground, but we need it. And so people will fight for wells and have forever. So we're going to look at the different types of how that water comes out of the ground differently. I really like this. I think this is pretty interesting. So spring is whenever groundwater comes out of the earth. So let's imagine that you have hills and valleys in the topography, and you've got a water table that's high enough to actually be above the lowest part of a valley. Well, that water will come out of the ground and flow out onto the ground. So normally will flow into a stream, but you can have along the side of a hill, if the water table is higher than the bottom of that valley, then the water will come out of the side of the hill, and that's a spring. If you were to have a water table that's lower than the bottom of the valley, but you do have a large area of flat rock somewhere higher than the bottom of the valley, okay, so remember that's an aquitard. If you have to where the water in that little area can't go all the way down into the water table, it basically forms its own little tiny water table higher up on the hill. Well, it can form a spring. If it intersects the land, then the water can come out of the side and you can get a spring there. So springs are, for mountain people, springs are it, because first of all, the water is clean and delicious and usually very cold. And normally, as long as it doesn't go into a drought condition, it is all during the year. You can get water from a spring. A really cool type of spring is hot water springs, and there are some hot water springs very close to here. Hot water springs, there's a couple of different causes of hot water springs. Either there's a hot spot, like a volcanic hot spot, close enough that it's underneath an area of groundwater, and it warms that water, and then when the water comes to the surface, it's warm. Or there's some kind of a fault line where there's a deep crack in the earth under a certain place, and then it goes deep enough to where it gets close enough to a hot spot that water that would fall into it can then go through that crack and then back out to the surface. So there's a couple different ways that happens, but totally amazing. Love the hot springs. Geysers are definitely over a hot spot, and it's the water table coming into a chamber that's over top of the heat. So let's say you have a hot spot of some kind of a magma chamber deep down, and you have water that flows in the water table above it, and it boils. And then as it boils, it needs to escape, and it essentially explodes out of the hole. And so it's very irregular because it'll explode and shoot out of the hole, and then the groundwater will seep back into that chamber, be heated by the same hot spot, and then do it over and over again, and you can almost set your watch by it. We've already talked about a well several times. So if you dig a tunnel, a vertical tunnel down into the water table, okay, so you go through the unsaturated zone into the saturated zone. Remember, saturated is where there's full of water. Then water can be drawn up through the well. The thing is that the water that's supplying the water table moves very slowly because that water is inside cracks and inside pores and spaces inside of rocks. And so if you're, say pumping water up through a pipe to the surface, or even doing it the old-fashioned way and taking a bucket all the way to the bottom and then drawing the bucket up, what's happening is that amount of water can be taken out of the well faster than the water in the surrounding rock can seep and find its level. So you end up with what's called a cone of depression around a well. And you can actually pump a well dry very, very easily if you pump it faster then the water can then seep out of the rocks and find its level. And of course, the water is being restored via rain through the ground, through the surface of the ground, or rain in the nearby area, whatever's in the same water table. So you don't want to take too much water out, or too many wells can't be in the same location because you could easily run it dry. Now, one of the coolest times I've ever seen a well was an artesian well. And an artesian well is not just well water coming out of a pipe, but actually blasting out of a pipe where it's in high pressure underground. And if you can give it a path to the surface, it'll take that path. So it's under stress. That water is being squished, and it will go right up the pipe, just like squeezing a bottle and having like a bottle of mustard and the mustard squeezing out of the top. That's exactly what's happening. You have high pressure under the ground. What's happened many times in an artesian system is you have two of these impermeable aquatards. Remember, aquatard is like the bottom of a swimming pool in a small area to where water above it can't get further down. And so it's almost like its own little water table. Well, if you have an impermeable level on the layer on the bottom, and then water on top of it, and then an impermeable layer on top of it, okay, so somehow the water had to get down into it, but if it has like a floor and a roof, and now water is drawn into it, so that water is completely filling that chamber, so it's an underground chamber of water. If you drill a hole into that, the water is under pressure, it will come out on its own, and that's called an artesian well. It's pretty fun. So here's an example. The dark brown layer is called the aquatard. That's an impermeable layer, so water can't get into it or out of it. And then water has actually come into this crack in between two of these impermeable layers of rock. And so it's packed in there, and it's under high pressure. So if you were to, say at number 1 have a well, it would just be a normal well. But if you had at 2 where there's actually pressure of water pushing down on that water, it's enough pressure to draw that water up on its own, and that's called an artesian well.